Far above the mortal planes, above the levels of elemental reality, one enters realms of pure metaphor. It is here that the gods dwell, and it is here that they play the games of the gods. The gods have dwelt there for as long as there have been gods, and there have been gods for as long as there have been mortals to call upon them. Though as to whether the gods came first and created mortals to worship them, or mortals came first and created gods by their worship, none can say. In all ways, the relation between gods and mortals is complicated, and the life of each is bound inextricably to the other. Can a song exist without singers? Is he a singer who has no song? Regardless, the gods dwell above and mortals dwell below. In their realm above, the gods play their games, and in the realm below mortals live the roles of pawns and pieces. Now the games of the gods are of course beyond the comprehension of any mortal, but if the concept might be rendered in terms the physical mind can grasp, they may be thought of as taking place upon a chessboard. The board representing the physical, social, and spiritual realm of each mortal race, modified to suit said race's societal landscape. Thus, the chessboard of the god of the goblins was crude and plain, with a basic minimum of spaces upon it, while the board of the god of elves was deep and multi-leveled, with whimsical side spaces whirling off in secret paths. Similarly, the playing pieces of the gods differed from race to race, in reflection of their mortal followers. The goblin god had only a cluster of wretched pawns around his king, while the elven god's playing set was huge and varied, with many strong pieces bearing unexpected powers. And so each god played his game, sometimes against the other gods, sometimes against themselves, and sometimes against some or all of their own pieces, because the relation between gods and mortals is complicated. And down in the world, armies marched and heroes quested and nations were born, died, and rose again, all in accordance with the games. It eventually came to pass that Ethrian, god of all elves, began to grow bored with playing the same games for the same stakes, repeating through the cycles of history. He craved a greater challenge, even as his followers in the great elvish empire craved greater purpose for themselves. So he set himself the task of defeating all the other gods and making his game the only one played in the realm of the gods. And the armies of the great elvish empire marshaled and marched forth to bring all the lands under their banner, that they might refashion the world into an image that better suited the elvish vision. Ethrian came first to the playing board of Othric, the god of the halflings, which was near to his own even as the halflings dwelt just at the borders of the lands of the elves. "Come," said Ethrian as he slammed his pieces upon the halfling god's board. "Let us play a final game, you and I. The stakes shall be your gaming board and all your pieces." And Othric, fearing the wrath of the mighty elvish god and his great power, meekly agreed and set out his own pieces, mostly pawns, though quick and devious ones, backed by a handful of knights and bishops, the few heroes and mages the halfling folk possessed. So too in the world did the halfling armies form up in defense of their land and liberties. A high-hearted militia, if an unpracticed one, for the halfling lands had known peace for an age. A high-hearted militia, if a smallish one, for the halflings were not a people known for martial prowess. A high-hearted militia, if a doomed one, for their god looked upon the host of pieces the elvish god set upon the board, and could only despair at the size and scope of his opponent's force. Thus it was that the game progressed. And despite Othric's best efforts, his brave, clever pawns were swept from the board by Ethrian's pieces, even as the halfling citizen militias were swept from the fields by the elvish archers, ridden down by their unicorn knights, and blasted from their hiding holes by the power of fey magic. Until soon, at negligible cost, Ethrian's pieces hemmed Othric's king into a corner of the board for check and mate, just as the elvish armies breached the walls of the final halfling city and hunted down its garrison for sport. And so the game board, and few remaining playing pieces of the god of the halflings, became the property of Ethrian, as the halfling lands became elvish lands, and the halfling folk who remained became but servants therein. Next was Grashak, god of the goblins. Ethrian set his pieces upon Grashak's board and bade him play, for the same stakes as he had offered Othric. Grashak, proud and stubborn and none too bright, readily agreed. He saw the vast array of pieces the elf god brought to bear, But he had no fear. For while he only had weak pawns to guard his king and throw against the might of the elvish host, those pawns had the trick of soon returning to the board once removed. For goblins bred fast and grew faster, with new generations constantly arising to take the places of the old. So long as he had free spaces upon his board and an unconquered king, Grashak could not run out of pawns. Battle was joined on gaming board and in the world, as Ethrien's pieces marched across the board and elvish men-at-arms swept the goblin lands. Grashak's pawns blundered into the oncoming tide and were lost one by one, like the goblin warbands that came against the elves in drips and drabs. And though more pawns rose up from the back row every turn and swarmed out to their own destruction, Ethrien's pieces methodically seized control of the board and eliminated each threat. And though more goblins poured from their dens to replace the fallen, they could not force back the inexorable advance of the elvish armies who cut them down with practiced ease. And eventually Grashak could bring forth no more pawns, for his whole back row was held by the elf gods' pieces, just as the goblin dens had been taken by the elvish warriors and their breeding caves purged with fire. Grashak, proud and stubborn and lacking in wit, fought on, desiring only to take a few more of Ethrien's pieces, and at least make his victory a costly one. But even this was not to be. And as the last few goblins fled by handfuls into the hidden depths of the mountains, or anywhere else that elves might not go, Grashak's king was taken, and he himself, reduced to a faded wraith by the loss of his worshippers, abandoned his game board to the elf god. And so it went with each opponent Ethrien faced. Morvian, god of the dwarves, fell despite his mastery of the defensive game and the resilience of his pieces. The fortress kingdoms of the dwarves were added to the great elvish empire, and the dwarves who remained crafted and labored to strengthen the forces of their conquerors. Gorak, god of the ogres, could not stand. His pieces were mighty, taking the combined efforts of several of Ethrien's to bring each one down, but were too few in number and too ill-played by their divine leader. Thus did ogrekind pass from the world and their hillside keeps become elvish fiefdoms. Zarl of the gnomes and Hruk of the orcs were taken next, their lands and followers added to the ranks of the elves' helots, along with their gods' game boards and pieces. And then all the rest, as the elves brought the whole of the known world under their sway, and Ethrien bested each of the gods in turn. Some were defeated at the game by his craft and strategy, by his command of the board, and others by the sheer power of his pieces, or the ever-growing number of his pawns. And once this was done, it looked as though no more challenges existed for Ethrien, god of the elves, while the lords of the great elvish empire stirred restlessly at the edge of their continent, having conquered all they surveyed and wondering, what next? It was then that Ethrien spied the god of the humans, Yahweh, sitting at his own playing board some distance away. Yahweh seldom interacted with the other gods, for his people dwelt on another continent across a mighty sea, and had scant dealings with the other races of the world. Ethrien had never played the game of the gods against Yahweh before, nor did he know of any other who had. This could well be the novelty he had been seeking. He gathered up his playing pieces and strode toward Yahweh's game board. Down in the world, elvish scouting galleys brought back to their commanders word of a continent across the sea, inhabited by a race unknown and untouched. Lords and generals rejoiced as fleets were amassed, armies loaded aboard, and the elvish imperial host went forth to bring yet more of the world under their superior stewardship. "Let us play," declared Ethrien, as he sat down opposite the human's god and began setting up his pieces. "The stakes will be your board and pieces, and do not think to refuse me." He let a bit of divine power, of which had an abundance since his people had grown so strong, flicker about his fingers, a warning of what to expect should Yahweh try to evade his challenge. Yahweh did not. The god of the humans just smiled and cocked his head a little and asked, "Are you sure this is what you want?" He spread his hands, gesturing at his playing board. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Ethrien scowled, taking note that Yahweh's board was one of the largest he'd yet played on. Furthermore, there were a large amount of extraneous junk piled around the table, papers and cubes and all manner of trinkets and maps. He sneered. "I am a master of the game of the gods, who has defeated all that have stood against me. I shall not fall for stall, bluff, nor delay. I shall sweep your pawns and pieces from the board as I have all others. I'm just trying to give you a chance, replied Yahweh, unperturbed. Before you do something you'll regret and lose everything you've worked for. I will lose nothing, for I intend to win this game as I have all others. Ethrian scoffed. And besides, the stake of this game is your board and pieces, not mine. Not yet, replied Yahweh. But then he sighed and began setting his own pieces on the board. They were numerous and varied, if not quite so much as Ethrian's. Ah, well, I tried to be merciful. That's kind of my thing these days, mercy and forgiveness. I used to be a lot more hot-headed, but all that ever got me or anybody else was heartache and regret. Ethrian, god of the elves, rolled his eyes and made his first move. King's Knight's pawn to King's Knight 4. Down in the world, a squadron of elvish war galleys landed just outside a coastal town. Archers, unicorn knights, and war mages storming ashore and cutting down any who dared oppose them with arrow, lance, and spell. Miss, said Yahweh. What? Asked Ethrian. Miss, the human god repeated. That was a miss. He held up a tiny white peg as though that meant something. What do you mean, miss? I mean you missed. You didn't hit. I don't understand. What are you taking about? Ethrian had wanted novelty. Feeling confusion for the first time in his divine existence was certainly novel, but he could not say he liked it very much. I mean, your move didn't strike anything. Well, not anything significant enough to alter the board. You didn't hit my battleship, in other words. Your guys are doing some damage to the civilians, sadly, with all that indiscriminate burning and such, but that doesn't affect actual game conditions. You speak nonsense, Yahweh. Take your turn. All right, said Yahweh with a shrug. No need to shout. He handed Ethrian a decorated cube. Roll for initiative. What? Roll for initiative. That thing I gave you is a die. Toss it on the board, and when it stops moving, count how many marks are on the face-up side. Somewhat baffled, Ethrian did as he was bid. 3? Yahweh threw out his own die. Ooh, I got a 6. That means I can sneak attack. You what? But Yahweh was busy writing something on a piece of lined paper. Okay, my fleet in Tyrrhenian Sea convoys my Queen's Flying Rook from Boardwalk to King's Knight 3, plus my sneak attack bonus. He handed the elf god a small icosahedron with numbers printed on it. Roll that and tell me what number comes up. 11? Yahweh appeared to consult a printed chart. Let's see. Elvish pawn. Ooh, you failed your saving throw versus death from above. And with that, he moved a piece from the back row and flicked aside Ethrian's advanced pawn, then picked up the vanquished piece and set it aside. Down in the world, a fleet of elvish war galleys and their attendant troops were caught by surprise as a force of steam-powered dirigibles appeared overhead and blasted the ships out of existence with some form of dropped explosives. As the airships then began landing troops of their own, the surviving elves within the conquered town rallied to their lord's banner and formed up in serried ranks to match their prowess against the human warriors. They appeared to be all spearmen, who would be coming to retake it. If those round ears thought they could match their thick-hafted spears against the swift blades and deadly arrows of an imperial elvish host, they would receive a rude awakening. But, to the elves' consternation, the human troops simply came to a halt just beyond longbow range, raised their spears to their shoulders, and began pouring volley after volley of some kind of mage thunder into the elvish ranks. That thunder shattered limbs, pierced breastplates, and blew holes clean through elves that were struck. First dismay set in, then fear, and then the rout. By the time the human warriors did advance to hand-fighting range, what remained was more slaughter than battle. What just happened? Ethrian was staring at the piece that had taken his pawn, that shouldn't, by all his understanding and experience of the game, be there at all, but somehow was. I took my turn, said Yahweh mildly, and now it's your move again. But how did... Ethrian trailed off, reddening at the pitying look Yahweh was giving him. You did say you were ready for this, the human god reminded. Ethrian closed his mouth with an audible snap and moved another piece. King's Bishop to King's Second Bishop 5. Down in the human lands, an elvish archmage and his retinue seized an island lighthouse near a major harbor. From there, his storm magic could render the air and water currents unusable to the human ships or flying devices, holding their fleets in place there. Crafty, Yava complimented. However, I'm paying 3 mana to activate my hidden pawn at your King's Second Knight's 4. He picked 3 coin-sized red discs from a stack at his right and tossed them aside, which caused a murky-looking pawn to appear at the designated square. And then playing my reverse card. He held up a small rectangle of cardstock, bright red on its face and bearing a double arrow symbol, then threw it after the mana tokens, enabling my hidden pawn to move backwards to your King's Second Bishop 5. Yavai moved the pawn diagonally back, taking the elvish bishop. Meanwhile, in the world of mortals, a human soldier crouching in the bushes on a rocky island brought a chanting, gesticulating elf in elaborate robes into the view of the brass telescope mounted atop his weapon. The elf stood atop a lighthouse tower several hundred yards away. Wind and rain were building by the moment, and lightning was beginning to flash in the distance. Still, he had a duty to perform, and besides, he couldn't help but feel that fortune was smiling upon him today for some reason. He pulled the trigger. The percussion cap detonated flawlessly. There was a blast of smoke and a flash and crack that were lost to the building storm, and blood flashed on a white robe as 400 years' worth of magical knowledge and learning died from 15 cents worth of lead and powder. Ethrian, god of all elves, slammed his hands on the board, jarring all the pieces as Yavai plucked his bishop off the board. I demand to know what you are doing, and I demand to know how you are doing it. This is not how the game of the gods is played. He let some divine power crackle around his hands, an unsubtle threat. If Yavai was moved by that display, he did not let on. I'm playing the game, all right, the human god explained. Our game boards reflect the shape of the societies we oversee. Our pieces represent those who worship us. You know this, I assume? Of course. Well, our playing styles, the methods we use, the very rules we follow, they do not exist independently of our followers. Rather, they reflect the mindset of the races who pray to us. Thus, your own play is orderly, regimented, each move calculated and crafted into an organic, inevitable, and harmonious whole. That is the elven way, Ethrian said, proud and stiff. Exactly. Yavai leaned back, smiling at the elf god. My guys, on the other hand, are devious, chaotic, massively overcomplicate everything for no good reason, and look for the loophole in every rule. But above all, Yavai winked and shook a finger at Ethrian. They cheat like you wouldn't believe. He chuckled and shook his head. Why do you think I had to become a god of forgiveness and mercy? It was either forgive the little turd heads, or wipe them out and try again with the chimpanzees. Anyway, it's your turn now. As Ethrian sat back at the game and tried to get his mind around a strategy, any strategy, that could cope with such an opponent, he heard Yavai laugh again. He looked to see the human god peering down into the world, at the armies of human riflemen mobilizing there, the foundries pouring out cannons and mortars and bayonets, the steam-driven fleets assembling in sea and sky in response to the elvish invasion. You said you were good at the game, Yavai said, still watching his humans. Well, I hope you get a grasp on it pretty quickly, because I've got a feeling that as soon as we're done here, we'll be playing a rematch on your board.